Today's guest on the Slingshot is Tim Wu, professor at Columbia Law School. Tim served a stint in the Biden White House where he was considered the architect of Biden's competition policies. Tim is the author of the new book, The Age of Extraction: How Tech Platforms Conquered the Economy and Threaten Our Future Prosperity, which we will be discussing today. The book explains how tech platforms manipulate attention, extract wealth, and deepen inequality, and Tim offers various policy prescriptions to reclaim control and create a balanced economy. Tim is also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, where he recently penned a piece asserting how Judge Boasberg relied on bad reasoning in the FTC's challenge of Facebook's acquisition of Instagram. We'll be talking about that one too. Welcome, Tim.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. And
Sure.
I'm joined by my usual partner in crime, Darren Bush. Darren, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
All right. Well, let's dive in. We're going to start with the book first, then we can circle back with the Times piece on the Facebook decision. So starting with the book, Tim, just by way of background, the book explains how dominant platforms can extract wealth from merchants in the case of Amazon or from publishers in the case of Google. And I just want to pick on Amazon just a bit. And you note that the take rate or the private tax that Amazon charges merchants has ballooned over the last decade from 19% in 2014 to over 50%, 50 today, and now encompasses new fees like advertising fees that are on top of the already inflated fulfillment rates. Now, under antitrust consumer welfare standard, which prevailed for a long time, at least until recently, exclusionary conduct was deemed anti-competitive only if consumers pay higher prices or purchase fewer products in some output market. And that standard could have condoned exclusionary conduct by Amazon, which is aimed at, as you explained, extracting wealth from input providers, namely merchants, in the input market. So my first question for you with that long windup is, why are so many antitrust thought leaders trying to take us back to this obviously deficient consumer welfare standard?
That's a great question. I mean, it is so obvious that it does not answer some of the fundamental questions that antitrust is concerned about. An example right here being the extractive power of monopoly, which is, one of the, if you just thought about like what are the problems that antitrust is worried about, one of it is monopoly power. It's kind of more of a, I guess, sociological question. I feel that if you're trained on something, you like it, although, Hal, and to your credit, you're also trained in microeconomics. Maybe part of it is this, sometimes you hear about consumer welfare, that the idea is that it is, more rigorous, more quantitative, I guess, and then, so therefore, other approaches are too wide-ranging or something like that. But even that, I mean, I've been in enough antitrust trials to tell you the consumer welfare standard is not exactly determinative either. It hasn't turned out to be this science that tells you who's going to win, who's going to lose. It's kind of all over the place. And sometimes just gives completely absurd results. So, I don't have a really straightforward answer for that, I'm afraid.
Well, before I pass it over to Darren, I just want to point out that even under the consumer welfare standard, right, wouldn't you agree that an inflated take rate on the merchant by Amazon would ultimately work its way into higher prices charged by merchants toiling on the Amazon platform?
I mean, that's the crazy thing is, obviously market power is ultimately usually passed through to the people who are going to pay in the end, consumers. I mean, one of the reasons I titled this book, The Age of Extraction, was a little bit of a poke at the kind of some adage in antitrust. It's kind of an inside joke where sometimes people say, well, it's merely extraction. And, that always bothered me because I was like, extraction is kind of the core of what antitrust should care about. And the Amazon examples you talk about are very extreme. I mean, part of the reason I wrote this book was to explore sort of the dream of the internet and what happened. And part of the original vision was the internet was going to make everybody wealthy. And, I think for a while, Amazon, when it had like a 19% margin was a way for independent merchants to make a lot of money and, kind of that dream fulfilled. But when it's 50%, when merchants are bidding against each other to knock down, bidding against each other for sponsored advertising spots and basically bidding away or competing away their own profit margins, it's a very different story. And the possibility of this being a major device of wealth redistribution and, kind of decentralized capitalism gets lost. And I can just throw one number in there. I'm sorry to go on at length, but the sponsored results on Amazon are now, in terms of income, and in 2024, I think they made $56 billion off of that to make the product worse because, it actually is worse. You can't get what you're searching for. You don't really know what the search results mean. And we're paying $56 billion, consumers and merchants combined, ultimately consumers, to make the product worse. And so that is, to me, kind of a classic case of valueless extraction. Sorry for the length
Oh
of
no,
my answer.
that was good. And when I think of extraction, I think of the costless extractions of things like blood diamonds.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, so let me push you. I agree with you on consumer welfare standard. Obviously, I've written on it. I'm an economist as well, but I want to push you a bit on the competitive process standard.
Yeah.
So, um, what constitutes, we are all in agreement, consumer welfare is a problematic standard. But what constitutes anti-competitive behavior under a protecting competition standard? And how does that differ from consumer welfare?
Yeah,
For example, if wouldn't it differ wouldn't the pro-competitive justification be different? Output wouldn't be a good argument under protect competition standard. Intellectual property might not be. Efficiencies in a merger case would probably be out. What's the difference?
yeah, it's a great question. And you're referring to, I think, a proposal that I made a few years ago saying that, as opposed to consumer welfare, we should roll back a little bit. I mean, a lot of courts discuss and describe um, protection of competition as the standard. There's a little split just legally in what is described. If you look carefully at, Microsoft, for example, the DC Circuit, and many other cases, it's always like, the idea is protecting competition. So what does it mean exactly to interfere with competition? So I'm afraid I'm going to give you more of a legal answer than like a quantitative. I do think showing harm to various parties involved in the competitive process can be evidence. But I think the goal of a protecting competition and protecting competitive process standard is closely linked to the theory of exclusionary, the process for determining exclusionary behavior under Section 2. I think it looks a lot like that, which is to say you're trying to prove that one way or another, there's some effect that is interfering with some model of what you would call normal, normal competition. That could be an uncompetitive agreement. That could be, a long-term contract that says no one gets to deal with this but you. In Microsoft, it could, in the Microsoft example, it could be a series of restrictive agreements that, with the threat of withholding Windows, force people to put a different browser up front. It's a little dependent on the particular jurisprudence, but the general purpose, the standard is to show that you have hindered or interfered with the normal process of competition using various forms of evidence. I also do think you still get a response to say it is pro-competitive, what you've been doing. But the main difference, I think, is as I interpret consumer welfare, it creates this burden of proof, and a lot of people will deny this, but I think from everything I've seen in practice, that says you have to show, this very specialized weird thing in many cases, easy in some cases, very hard in exclusionary cases, that there was actual, price harm inflicted on a consumer. And, it's kind of a random walk when you can do that or not. And particularly in exclusion cases, I mean, how exactly are you going to fix that? So they often fudge it anyways. So that's the idea of the protection of competition or competition to protect competitive process standard.
Sweet. Well, let me turn back to this book and this one chapter in particular. I think you do a wonderful job explaining how anti-monopoly can be seen as an industrial policy. And you use the interventions to rein in AT&T in the 50s and IBM in the 60s as examples. And I just want to say, for those who haven't read the book yet, why is it so important to go back and retell these stories of successful antitrust interventions?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand just how pro-innovation antitrust enforcement can be. And to counter the narrative, which I think is very common right now, that if you cause even the slightest distress to anyone who's in the tech industry, you're an enemy of the future and are trying to stop improvements in building and so forth. If you look at the track record of antitrust enforcement in the second part of the 20th century, first part too, but let me stick with the second part. Every time they go in, Justice Department goes in, it leads to a lot of people quitting jobs, starting new companies, and sometimes the birth of new industries. So if you look at the 56 AT&T decree, which licenses the transistor patent, suddenly you have, all kinds of people leaving Bell Labs and starting semiconductor companies and, Process, Shockley, Fairchild, Intel, all these, basically the birth of the U.S. Semiconductor industry, not to mention an aid to the computing industry, which AT&T is in a position to take on. So like two, extraordinarily important industries. Justice Department goes after IBM in the late 60s, early 70s. The first thing IBM does to try to settle the case is open up software. So through the 70s, you suddenly have more room. You have a kind of a platform in IBM and the ability to compete with new software companies. That period, it's not the only reason, but you do see Oracle, you see Sun, you see Apple, all these companies, Microsoft being built in that period. You see the IBM PC being invented in a way that is very cautious of antitrust and is not done in a way that preserves IBM's control, such that there's a big birth of clone industries. Go on Microsoft, you attack Microsoft in the 90s, and out of that comes a browser explorer, which is the monopoly that can't crush early companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon and others. So time after time, you intervene and you have a flourishing, an explosion of new activity. It's not the only cause. I wouldn't make that kind of claim. But I certainly think that putting pressure on monopolists is a form of industrial policy, removing the exclusionary effects, stirring up competition. I note in the book, and I have a paper coming out, it might be a small book, a monograph on antitrust and industrial policy, a misunderstood relationship. And one of the things I point out is that in other industries like Boeing, or aerospace, and also in automotive, the United States held back on antitrust, sometimes gave companies a free pass like Boeing. And, the result is we've had the same companies dominate automotive in the U.S. and aerospace for the last, 70 years or so. And they show every sign of, classic stagnation. Eventually, it's trade that gets them going, if anything, competition with foreign companies. So, I think antitrust has been a very successful industrial policy, very successful tech policy. And I just wanted to remind people of that in an age where people are like, oh, no, if you even dare inconvenience Google for one instant, that's going to cede the future to China. So that's the point of that part of the book.
Okay. So let's talk about your chapter 15 and then part 4 of your book. And you address redistribution and I think reject it. And I'm thinking back to the New Deal consensus and the fact that for a period of time we had come closest to income equality, minimizing income inequality. It wasn't perfect and namely in areas of race and gender discrimination. But what you advocate in part 4 about platforms, I I'm going to make a statement here, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree. It doesn't necessarily cure by themselves the evils of income inequality and impacts on democracy. For example, the mechanisms for restructuring the platforms are in place that you advocate in part four. That doesn't necessarily resolve de-skilling issues, generational wealth acquisition, and other societal issues. Do you agree with that, or
Well, I
have
want to discuss one thing in the premise. I don't um, reject redistribution, I think, entirely. I think what I want to be careful to reject is a kind of consensus or a position that I would say some allies and sort of liberals, people would consider themselves progressives, which is fine, and I think it's useful to have disagreement, would take, which roughly, and I kind of associate this with, say, the Clinton era, which, and parts of Obama era, which is to say, we're going to essentially tolerate monopoly profit, tolerate a an economy dominated by oligopolies and monopolies, because we can always tax it later and redistribute the money. And I think the problem with that philosophy, it's not logically incorrect. I just think it contains the seeds of its own failure, which is to say, which for the reason that when entities get money, they rarely want to give it up. And so the distribution later part doesn't come. If we had some kind of political system where you could guarantee that if could make a deal and say, all right, we will tolerate uh, we will, like, say, suspend anti-monopoly law for a while, but you have agreed to, as soon as you achieve, 4 years of monopoly, start paying 50% taxes or something. I might be willing to say that, maybe that would work. I still have some questions about being a two-class society, basically a class of monopolists and a class of people getting money from the monopoly. But I might buy it. But the more serious problem is the part two never comes. The pie doesn't get cut. There is no pie. There's money that arrives in private bank accounts and that nobody wants to give up. So that is, and by its nature, our design will not want to give up because entitlements, and here entitlements, I mean income, it's not something people have given up with much willingness at any time. So that's my complaint about that solution to the problem of inequality and imbalance. Um,
so? Let me just
yeah.
follow up on that. And first of all, I apologize for not having my camera on before, but you all online can now see my cool double-edged sword form routine. Um, but that implicitly suggests to me, in terms of the abundance agenda, that you would reject that out of hand, because the whole notion of that is sort of a focus on economic growth without regulatory barriers and no system of taxation to follow either. So there's an implicit.
I guess yeah, I disagree. First, I mean, I disagree with many things with the abundance. I agree with one or two things about the abundance agenda, which I think everyone in the world can agree that stupid regulation that doesn't achieve its purpose is not good. Which is a little bit of a straw man. I don't know if anyone, but there is at times regulation that has just like not served its purpose, is not really doing anything. And okay, so maybe that's an easy take. First, I disagree first with several of the premises of the abundance movement. One is I disagree that monopolies have a good track record of growth at all. I think competitive markets have a better track record. I just let's compare telecom. Let's talk about telecom, computing, automotive, and aerospace. I mean, aerospace has been basically an American monopoly in competition with Airbus. I mean, that sector has not grown at all, and they have barely innovated other than like making the seats smaller. And automotive, electric cars are, but generally General Motors has kind of been the picture of stagnation and has been rescued multiple times. So if that's what the abundance agenda is talking about, that we want more economies to look like GM and Boeing, I just don't think that's particularly attractive. So I think competition is much better. And yeah, you're right. They don't have much of a taxation. They don't even have the taxation part. So obviously I don't agree with that. They have a blind spot to the problem of monopoly, as if they hadn't like read an economics textbook or looked at the history of monopoly in operation.
So, Tim, one of the prescriptions in the book, you suggest that we regulate the platforms, and in particular by subjecting them to bans on business discrimination. I want to try to press you for a concrete example of a type of discrimination by a platform that you'd like to see regulated out of existence.
I'll just take it easy. I don't see what anyone really gains from Amazon doing business on their own platform, and particularly discriminating against themselves. I went a little step even further then, but self-preferencing, I just don't. So I think I say in the book that in some ways the platforms, in my mind, have kind of a main character syndrome problem. They've proven they're essential. I'm not saying like you could abolish them or anything, but in certain areas, they're kind of become like the electric network. And if we had like the electric network, and then electric network was selling its own appliances and having them operate for cheaper, or like making other things work worse, we'd be like, what the hell is this business? And also, if the electric company could charge any price it wanted, we'd think that is crazy. And the thing about this is a really key point about discrimination is I think the very prospect of seeking the possibility of capturing rents from someone on the platform itself discourages innovation at time one. I mean, if you think at an initial stage, you're thinking, I'm going to invest in this app or whatever, but then, you might be discriminated against. They might find some clever way to advantage themselves or advantage some who pays them off. It discourages innovation and investment. So there's a very strong pro-growth, frankly, building argument for neutral platforms. I mean, my first half of my career was net neutrality, where I thought this case was very strong. And I think it's totally true on the platforms today. It's like, if you don't think you can make money, why would you invest? And I think that's an ongoing problem with the online. It's becoming a place where the returns are only for the platforms. So it ends up, I think, being a damper on U.S. economic activity.
And going back to the electricity example, we used to be concerned about when, we still are to some degree about, self-preferencing of electric generation assets by utilities that own the transmission lines. Richard Tabor had his famous article, Gaming Transmission for Fun and Profit, right? Which is kind of a self-preferencing argument. So this goes way back. But
that's interesting. I'm not aware of that, but I just think like sometimes it's important to look at what we take for granted. I mean, the electric network is incredible catalyst of innovation. The computing industry depends on it, like telecom depends on it to some degree. All the electronics industries, like everything depends on it. And we don't really spend a lot of time talking about, there's problems with electric generation and but we never say, first we don't say two things. We don't say, we can't possibly, regulate electricity rates because we have to rely on Con Ed or PGE to invent like the next new thing. Instead they empower people who invent the next new thing and a lot more people. And we also don't have a problem of saying, oh my God, they cut some weird deal with Samsung, so Apple phones don't charge, or all kind of weird stuff like that to try to extract rents. It just all can't, all set at zero. And I think that has been an extraordinarily successful policy, so successful you don't even think about it.
So the Section 230 folks would sit here and argue related to the fact that this is a public, if you're attempting to regulate this as a public utility, it's a different than, it is different than telecom, it is different than gas generational electricity, in that you are talking about speech. And so you can't necessarily regulate the social media platforms as public utilities. And it sounds like, is there a compromise happy position between what you're advocating and the Section 230 crowd, or is this just a sticking point?
I think it's very clear what should be going on with Section 230. So I accept, I think there is an obvious compromise point. So, the original idea of Section 230 was to make it possible, frankly, to run platforms that have millions of speakers on them without thinking that if any of those millions of people, is in any way violates any laws, you're on the hook. Just that model is, quite honestly impossible to run. But and also, would inhibit free speech in a significant way, where, every Reddit article, I mean, all these companies have their own content policies, but, if you had everything with potential liability, it could be some of these platforms cannot run it all. So I believe, I respect that view, but the platforms crossed a line when they began becoming the promoters of speech. And, at this stage, they're just very actively involved in choosing what to show people. And when they get into that business, when they are, the curators, the promoters, the decision makers, even if it's done through an algorithm, I don't care about that. But when they're telling you, okay, here's what you need to watch, that to me is a completely different line. And I think that they should be liable for. Now everyone says, okay, everything's algorithmically designed. I think that's an oversimplification. And I think that they should own the stuff that they promote. And I think that's the easy compromise. I won't say it's easy. That's the compromise.
Um, Now, another prescription that the book puts out there entails price regulation, and you point to the UK's limit on swipe fees charged by credit cards. And I'm curious, I don't think the book goes this far, but I just want to see if I can push you. Would you support a similar limit, say on the take rate that Amazon can charge merchants, or the rate that Google charges publishers?
I think
Um,
it's been long enough. Let's stick with Amazon first.
okay.
I think it's been long enough that, um, and the marketplace is established enough, and we understand enough that even though I am somewhat hesitant about, uh, like anyone who is, been raised, I guess, it's in earlier, somewhat cautious. I think that once you reach a point where you can see what's going on, that maybe the time has come. In fact, I think I'll say right now, I would support just a take rate on the Amazon marketplace. It is not going anywhere, and it's just extracting enormous amounts of money from businesses around the United States. So why support that tax? And yeah, and so yeah, I think that's where I am on those, and also same with Google and publishers. We just have unregulated monopoly power, and we have durable, lengthy profit at such margins that you're just like, this is crazy. This is the kind of thing people created public callings and common carriage to deal with when they saw it. So I think we're there, and I think my position is now that.
Yeah. And do you think there's a prospect, a reasonable prospect of getting legislation like this through Congress? I'll just point out that the last two bills that would have regulated the platforms, I think uh, Chuck Schumer prevented both from coming to a floor vote, even though they made it out of Senate Judiciary. Do you think that there's a chance that perhaps with a differently constituted Democratic Party, there would actually be a shot that these bills could make it through?
There needs to be a change in the Democratic Party and Congress in which those bodies start doing what people want. And I think if you just asked anyone whether they think the platforms have too much economic power and take too much, and they'd say, "Are you kidding?" Obviously. The same with like privacy law. There's so many extremely popular, obvious forms of legislation that when I was there never managed to reach a vote. Maybe even if you have a Democratic leader who lets stuff come to a vote or any kind of, and see what happens. But nothing comes to a vote. I think we need to clean house in the Democratic Party on this kind of stuff, or at least, make it clear that you will somehow face some kind of voter scrutiny. And, the leadership of the party has hidden all this stuff. And there's some low-level grifting going on with all the promises, campaign donations, all these ways in which tech platforms have tried to insulate themselves. But we need a new generation of politicians who is very serious about what they're going to do about the things that really matter to most Americans.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic though that what's causing the struggles with respect to policy is a political bottleneck. So
That's
so
true.
let's,
I mean, the
let's
Republican. I'm not trying to let the Republican Party off the hook. They're even more, they're more outlandish. Yeah.
it's true. Let's get meta. Let's talk about your New York Times piece called "The Bad Reasoning in the Meta Antitrust Ruling Isn't Even the Worst Part." And in that, you argue that Judge Boasberg got it wrong and essentially forgiving Meta for past sins as a monopolist because of the recent popularity of TikTok. And that you then raise it as a larger problem, despite a decade, I'm quoting you here, despite a decade of Meta-related scandals and whistleblowers, no public authority in this country has been able to hold the company meaningfully accountable for its behavior, a striking failure of our political system. Unfortunately, this ineffectuality is part of a broader trend. And your detractors on Twitter went wild, suggesting that you were wrong about the case, worried about your ability to teach antitrust because of your piece. The usual good faith intellectual arguments you and I have perpetually experienced online. So my question to you is, did you, here's your chance to talk to your detractors.
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I don't read like the comments on my tweets. So if there was detraction, I didn't notice. Um, I think it's obvious. I think it speaks for itself that that the case is wrongly decided. It's I watched trial proceedings. I think Boasberg had to twist himself into some really weird knots to find that a company that has a lengthy, a lasting, durable profits was not a monopoly over the market that the government had outlined. It had to go in all kinds of wild directions to avoid that conclusion. And yeah, I just think he flat out got it wrong. And I also think it was kind of tragic that it ended up being litigated as of right now. And in fact, not even when the complaint was filed, not even when discovery, but it just kept going and going and going and going. But no, I think it was just on the straight up, is there monopoly power here? I don't know how you work your way around the the lasting durable profits in a proven market that Facebook held on to, but name we're talking about friends and family. So I didn't see any response to that, which seemed to me very convincing.
Fair enough. Well, let me talk to you about like incremental change versus more massive change. Because it seems to me there's what I've dubbed the Section 2 trap, which is this. There's, permissive mergers and acquisitions. And in big tech, that's partly because we have a terrible potential competition doctrine standard, right? And partly because we have very permissive merger laws because of consumer welfare and also the vagaries of political wins. So so how do you fix this? Do you keep pushing on a case by case, pushing the law in incremental steps? Do you fix it in Congress, which seems almost impossible right now? Can you fix this without a massive restructuring of our antitrust laws?
Can I ask you first what you meant by the Section 2 trap? Um, as I have not heard that particular
Sure.
phrase. Yeah,
Problem is you have a whole bunch of acquisitions,
like
and
serial
so
acquisitions. Yeah,
and you basically you have a permissive Section 7, and then when you try to go after company in Section 2,
I
it's
see.
invariably harder to break up the company or undo those acquisitions ex post.
Right. And you're saying the trap is the fact there's a gap between Section 2 and Section 7 jurisprudence, for example.
Correct.
Yes, that's right. There's a David Lawrence who's he has a draft paper out there somewhere about like the gap between Section 2 and Section 7 jurisprudence. So one of the problems is the incoherence and the drift that has happened between Section 2 and Section 7. such that, it doesn't fully line up, as I say. You end up with this trap. Um, it seems, I mean, I think the Facebook case is a big disappointment, um, because it was an opportunity. Part of it is just the crazy timingness of it. 2020 was not a crazy time, but 2025 uh, is really an unfortunate length of time. The judge deserves blame for this because he is the one who handled things so slowly to have this case go on. But to answer your question most directly, I think all of the above. So first, I do think the enforcement agencies should be challenging things retroactively that clearly were wrong at the time. They're going to make mistakes. They put mergers on parole and figure out if they got it wrong. And obviously they got it wrong. I mean, they got it wrong in ways as well. It sort of seems sometimes time just makes things incredibly obvious. And law is, I mean, here's another mindset thing that needs to change. I mean, law is inherently backward looking with very few exceptions. If someone robbed a bank in 2012, you don't ask like, okay, what did he do with the money? Or, was he a good citizen? Or, it's crazy. There's a certain level of craziness built into some of the time horizons between Section 7. So, how do you fix it? I would say all the above. I think you should bring cases where it just seems painfully obvious that the merger was anti-competitive. How you deal with the required monopoly, I don't know. The potential, I agree that the potential competition doctrine is an obstacle that I feel like you should, honestly, I think you should plead around as opposed to trying to confront sometimes. And if Congress, I mean, so many of the problems of the last 30, 40 years, even the problems of why we have such a polarized electorate, to my mind, come back to the fact that Congress fundamentally has not done its job. I mean, it is the part of government that is supposed to, first and foremost, respond to large-scale economic imbalances. It is what took most of the action during the Progressive era, along with law enforcement. It was the center of the New Deal. It is supposed to be there, and it's, we're like a man who's had a stroke and half his brain isn't working. There's a lot of functions that are supposed to be Congresses that are not happening now. And they are responsible for the extraordinary inequality, wealth inequality, and I say they're responsible for creating conditions which have led to, extremist authoritarian rulers able to say, listen, no one's going to do the job, I'm going to do the job. So, yes, Congress, I'm not obviously even the first, last, or middle person to say Congress has failed, but I just want to point the finger where it belongs.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe wrap it up with this final question. Your piece did not point, I don't think, to Judge Mehta's decision in the Google search case at the remedies. But I'm curious, when how your reaction was to that as well, and when you combine that with Judge Boasberg's decision, do you feel a bit at all delusioned ever about the prospect that antitrust can and modern day jurists or judges can really rein in these tech behemoths?
I mean, I think they're very disappointing. And I say that because, you have a government program. I mean, imagine almost any other area. We have, a large scale government program. You go through all, you invest money in it, you do all this thing. And then like one day a judge wakes up and feels kind of wimpy that day and he decides not to really do much about Google or whatever. It is, I can't, I never thought I'd be the guy to say this because I feel like I had more faith in the federal judiciary. But it is crazy to allow like a single person to sabotage what is a relatively important macroeconomic measure. I mean, if you think, imagine the Federal Reserve, for example, was like, oh my God, we have a huge crisis financial system. We need to do something, about we did quantitative, whatever they decide to do. Then all of a sudden, like a random one person guy just says, sorry, we're not doing that. I mean, it would be insane. So it's a crazy way. I think merger policy and monopoly policy are part of macroeconomic policy. It does seem to be crazy that judges have taken this role like, I don't really feel like it. It strikes me, even like in the old days of Standard Oil, I mean, they still broke up Standard Oil. They added the rule of reason, or they do things that people don't agree, but, they had some sense that this was the government's economic and democratically elected program, and they're along to make that happen. So yeah, I think it has set me back a bit. On the other hand, it is also two cases. There's more to antitrust, more to tech than two cases. There's other tech cases, but no, it is a major setback. There's no reason to deny it.
Okay. Well, I think with that, we're going to have to wrap it up. But Tim, I
Yeah.
really appreciate you coming onto the show and sharing your thoughts. And I encourage everyone to race out and go get the book. It was a real page turner, I have to say. I mean, I read it quickly, and I just felt it was very well done. And I'm a big fan. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, I'm a big fan of you guys, so it's just this is a love fest, I guess, is what they call it. But really, keep up the good work. I kind of try and stay away from some of that Twitter stuff. I mean, just on that, the public doesn't care about that stuff, and it's kind of maybe entertaining getting that stuff, but we're talking about really important questions of economic policy here. We're not, having stupid fights about, microeconomics on Twitter is, I guess, is important at some point, but I'm worried it is a distraction from the big picture story here, which is trying to rebalance the economy.
Great. Well, very, very well put. Thanks again for coming on.
Bye.